It all started like a fairy tale, or at least, that's what I thought at first. I met Mark when I was 23, right after I graduated from college. He was everything I had ever dreamed of: charming, ambitious, funny, and just the right amount of mysterious. At the time, I had no idea that the very things that drew me to him would eventually be the same things that would tear us apart. Mark made me feel special, like I was the only one who mattered. Our relationship moved quickly, but I wasn't complaining. He was a man of big dreams, and I admired that. I found myself falling for him harder than I ever expected. It felt like we were two pieces of a puzzle, perfectly fitting together. Within 2 years, we were married, and I thought to myself that I had it all: love, a beautiful home, a future. But then, something started to shift. It wasn't an instant change, but over time, I noticed little things that began to gnaw at me. It was so subtle at first that I barely recognized it. His late nights at work became more frequent. At first, I brushed it off. After all, he was always the ambitious one. He loved his job, and I supported that. But then, there were the phone calls. His phone buzzed at all hours of the day and night, and more than once, I caught him quickly glancing at it and then turning it face down when I entered the room. I wasn't the kind of person who was overly suspicious, but something about those little moments made me uneasy. One evening, I walked into the living room to find Mark on the phone. He was laughing, a full, hearty laugh that I had never heard him use with me. He looked happy, almost too happy. He spoke in a soft, low voice, and while I couldn't hear exactly what he was saying, there was an intimacy in his tone that made my stomach turn. As I stood there, frozen in the doorway, I noticed how quickly he snapped his phone shut when he saw me. He had been talking to someone who made him laugh in a way that I hadn't seen in months. The doubt began to creep in, slowly at first, like a shadow that followed me everywhere. I told myself I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was overthinking things. But every time I walked into a room and found him quickly ending a call or shutting his phone, the doubt grew stronger. I found myself asking, what's really going on, but never fully allowing myself to answer. It wasn't just the phone calls or the late nights. There was an emotional distance between us that had begun to form. Mark, who had once been so present, now seemed distant, always preoccupied with something that I couldn't see or understand. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that life had just gotten busier. Maybe he was stressed at work, maybe he was just tired. I wanted to believe that there was nothing more to it. But the unease continued to build. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to his quiet breathing beside me, wondering if I was the only one awake with the weight of it all pressing on my chest. I didn't want to admit it, but the signs were there. The lack of affection, the secretive behavior, the emotional withdrawal, it all pointed to something. But what? I couldn't bring myself to ask, not yet. One night, I decided to do something I never thought I would. I tried to search through his things. I knew I was crossing a line, but I was desperate for answers. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just a clue, something to ease the turmoil that had been brewing inside me. But when I opened the drawer where I knew he kept his phone charger, I found nothing that could give me the answers I needed. There were no texts, no incriminating evidence, nothing. Still, the doubt didn't go away. It lingered, waiting in the back of my mind, growing with each passing day. I wanted to believe that I was just being paranoid. After all, how could I accuse him of something without proof? How could I destroy the life we had built together over a feeling? But sometimes, feelings are all we have to go on. Sometimes, that gut instinct is the only truth you can trust. And that's when I realized my marriage was no longer what I thought it was. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew something wasn't right. It was the beginning of a silent war, fought in the shadows. I couldn't prove anything yet, but the unease in my heart was undeniable. And it was only a matter of time before I could no longer ignore it. I had tried to ignore it for so long, but there was no denying it any longer. The little things, the late nights, the secretive phone calls, the emotional distance, had built up into something undeniable. I couldn't pretend I didn't know. My gut had been screaming at me for weeks, but it wasn't until I heard the woman's voice that I could no longer turn a blind eye. Mark's affair wasn't just a suspicion anymore, it was a reality that I had to confront. I had no proof, just the weight of my own instincts and the growing discomfort that had settled in my chest. I had spent sleepless nights wondering whether I should even bring it up, but I couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. So, that night after dinner, when Mark was sitting on the couch scrolling through his phone, I decided it was time. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. I took a deep breath and sat next to him, my heart racing in my chest. The words felt like they were stuck in my throat, but I forced them out. "Mark, I need to ask you something. Are you seeing someone else?" He looked up at me, surprised, but his eyes didn't meet mine. Instead, he stared at the wall behind me, a flicker of something I couldn't quite place flashing in his gaze. For a moment, I thought he might deny it, laugh it off, or maybe even get angry, but he just stayed silent. "Because I've heard things," I continued, my voice trembling slightly. "And I know what I heard. I know what's been going on. You've been distant, you've been secretive. And I can't keep living like this, wondering if I'm crazy or if there's something more to it." Mark shifted uncomfortably on the couch. His lips tightened, and I could see the tension building in his shoulders. His silence was louder than any words he could have said, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me. He had heard the accusation before, and I could tell it was a question he didn't want to answer. "You're overreacting," he finally muttered, his voice cold and dismissive. "You're imagining things, Emily. There's nothing going on. I've been working hard, and that's all. Nothing more to it." I could feel the anger bubbling inside me, but I held it back. I had to get to the truth. "Mark, I'm not stupid. I've seen the way you've been acting. And I've heard you talking to someone else. Flirting. Laughing. I know what's going on." His face hardened at the mention of the phone calls. "That's ridiculous," he snapped. "You're blowing everything out of proportion. I don't know what you're talking about, but I'm not cheating on you." The words stung, but it wasn't the denial that hurt, it was the certainty in his voice. He sounded so sure of himself, so convinced that his lies were convincing enough to keep me quiet. But inside, I knew the truth. I could feel it. My heart was racing, and my stomach twisted in knots. I wanted to believe him, I really did, but everything in me told me I couldn't. "You're lying," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I don't have proof, but I know you're lying." There was a long silence between us, and in that moment, I could see it in his eyes, the moment he knew he was caught. But instead of apologizing, explaining, or trying to salvage what was left of us, he stood up abruptly. "I'm done with this," he said, his voice low and final. "If you don't trust me, then what's the point of this marriage? I don't need this kind of accusation." I didn't have time to respond before he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. "Mark, please," I begged, but it was too late. He was already gone. The door slammed behind him, and I was left in the silence, alone with my heartache. I had confronted him, but instead of an apology, I got rejection. The man I loved, the man I had trusted with my heart, walked out the door without looking back. The weight of it all crashed over me. I had no proof, but my instincts had been right all along. And in that moment, I realized something I wasn't ready to face. Mark had chosen her over me. The next few days felt like a blur. Mark's absence left an empty void in the house, one that felt suffocating, even though it was just me. I didn't know what I expected when I confronted him, but it wasn't this. I didn't expect him to walk out as though I had never mattered. I didn't expect the weight of rejection to hit me as hard as it did. It was like my whole world, my whole sense of self, had crumbled in an instant. I spent the first few hours after his departure crying, pacing the house, questioning everything I had ever believed in. How could he leave so easily? How could he just walk out without even trying to make things right? But the truth was, I didn't have the answers. I didn't even know where he had gone or who he was with. The silence between us spoke volumes. His actions had confirmed what I feared, but the pain of his departure still felt unbearable. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, I started to get used to the emptiness. The house, once filled with laughter and conversation, now felt cold and hollow. I tried to keep busy, but the reality of being alone in a home that once felt like a shared space was overwhelming. The silence screamed at me, and all I could think about was Mark. Even though he had left me with nothing, no explanation, no apology, I couldn't stop thinking about him. I was angry, heartbroken, confused. How could someone I loved so deeply turn their back on me so easily? How could he leave me without a second thought? But more than anything, I was hurt. My trust had been shattered, not just in him, but in myself. I had always prided myself on being someone who saw things clearly, who trusted her instincts. But I had been wrong about him. I had been wrong about everything. I tried reaching out to him several times, but he never responded. His phone calls went unanswered, and his texts remained unread. It was as though I didn't even exist to him anymore. The hurt turned to bitterness, and I found myself wondering if he had been planning this all along. If the woman he had been seeing had been there all the time, waiting in the wings. I couldn't shake the image of him with her, laughing, sharing moments that should have been mine. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't bring myself to call it quits entirely. A part of me still held on to the hope that he would come back, that he would realize his mistake and apologize. But deep down, I knew I was holding on to a fantasy. He wasn't coming back. Not for me. Not for us. It wasn't until I reached out to one of my closest friends, Sarah, that I started to see things more clearly. Sarah had always been the voice of reason in my life, the one who told me when I was being foolish or naive. After listening to me vent for what felt like hours, she finally spoke the words I didn't want to hear. "Emily, I think you need to let go." It was like a punch to the gut. Let go? How could I let go of the man I had loved so deeply? How could I let go of everything we had built together? But as I sat with her words, something started to shift. I realized that I had been holding onto a version of Mark that no longer existed, a version of him that had been replaced by someone I didn't know. The man who walked out on me wasn't the man I had married. The love I had once believed in was gone, and it was time for me to let it go. It wasn't easy, and it didn't happen overnight. But slowly, I started to heal. The pain didn't disappear, but it became more manageable. I stopped looking for answers from him and started finding them within myself. And though I still thought about him every day, the woman I had once been, the woman who trusted, loved, and believed, began to emerge again. I realized that I didn't need him to validate my worth. I didn't need him to make me whole. I could do that on my own. In time, I learned to let go. And with that, I started to reclaim my own life. As the weeks went by, I became increasingly accustomed to life without Mark. My daily routine was no longer disrupted by his unpredictable mood swings or his distant presence. I had grown used to the silence in the house, to the empty space beside me in bed. But something else began to emerge in the aftermath of his departure: clarity. It wasn't until I started going through our old messages and emails that I found the first clue. At first, I wasn't looking for anything specific. I had decided to start cleaning up, deleting old photos and conversations, trying to let go of the past in a tangible way. But then, buried among the digital detritus, I found a conversation that stopped me cold. It was a message from a number I didn't recognize, one of those strange, unfamiliar contacts that I had never questioned before. At first, it seemed innocent enough, a casual exchange of words. But as I read further, my stomach dropped. The messages were intimate, flirtatious even, and the language used was far more personal than anything I had ever seen between us. There, in black and white, were the words I had been afraid of all along. Mark had been seeing someone else for much longer than I had ever known. The texts painted a picture of a relationship I had never imagined. They spoke of secret meetups, inside jokes, and moments that he had never shared with me. I scrolled through message after message, the betrayal sinking deeper with each one. It wasn't just an affair, it was an emotional betrayal, a breach of trust on a level I had never thought possible. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. How could he have hidden this from me for so long? How could he have been so deceptive, lying right to my face all those months, all those years? I thought about the times when I had questioned him about being distant, when I had asked if something was wrong. How many times had he lied to me in those moments? How many times had I trusted him, only for him to betray me behind my back? But amidst the anger and heartbreak, something else began to stir inside me: the need for closure. I had always wondered why he left so easily, why he walked out without so much as a second thought. But now I had the answer. He had already moved on. He had already chosen her over me, and it was clear from the messages that he had been planning to leave for some time. The affair wasn't something that had just happened. It had been a slow burn, a premeditated decision. He had made his choice, and it wasn't me. I couldn't help but wonder about her. Who was she? What was she like? Was she everything I wasn't? Or was she just someone who had filled the void that I hadn't even known was there? There were so many questions swirling in my mind, but I knew I didn't need answers. The truth was clear. Even if I hadn't wanted to face it, I wasn't the one he wanted anymore. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that, in some twisted way, this revelation was freeing. I no longer had to wonder whether I was crazy or imagining things. I wasn't wrong. Mark had been hiding something from me. And as painful as it was to acknowledge, it was the closure I had been searching for. It gave me the clarity I needed to move on, to stop clinging to a version of our relationship that no longer existed. As I sat there, staring at the screen in front of me, I finally understood. Mark wasn't coming back, and I didn't need him to. I had the strength to move forward on my own, to rebuild my life, even if it meant leaving behind the man I had once loved. The truth had set me free, and I was ready to let go. Time passed, and with each day, I grew stronger. I had begun to reclaim my life, piece by piece. The pain, though still present, had dulled to a manageable ache. I filled my days with activities that nourished my soul, writing, spending time with friends, rediscovering old passions. I even took on a new project at work, something that helped me feel productive and in control, like I was finally taking charge of my own future. Though I had let go of the illusion that Mark and I could ever be the same, I was surprised by how much I had grown in the process. I had rediscovered my sense of self. No longer was I the woman defined by the man who had once promised to love me forever. I was Emily, strong, independent, and capable of standing on my own 2 feet. I had learned to trust myself again, to trust my instincts. Then, just as I was starting to feel truly content with my life again, the unexpected happened. Mark reached out. It was an email, of all things. No phone calls, no text messages, just an email with the subject line, "Can we talk?" My heart raced as I clicked open the message. The words were simple, but they sent a wave of emotions crashing over me. I know I've hurt you. I've made terrible mistakes. But I need to tell you something. Please meet me, just once. I owe you that much. My immediate instinct was to ignore it. I had spent months rebuilding myself, and here he was, showing up out of nowhere, demanding a chance to explain himself. The nerve! But even as anger flared within me, another emotion tugged at my heart. I was curious. Curious about why he had contacted me now after everything. Curious about what he had to say. I took a deep breath, weighed my options, and decided to meet him. But I knew this meeting wouldn't be about reconciliation. It wouldn't be about going back to what we had. It would be about closure. It would be about understanding why things had gone so wrong. We met at a small cafe, the place where we used to go when we wanted to escape the world. The same table, the same coffee. The only thing that had changed was the space between us. Mark looked different, older, regretful, and undeniably broken. His eyes were tired, and the confidence I had once seen in him was gone. He seemed smaller somehow, diminished. He apologized again, over and over, as if that would somehow fix everything. He told me that his affair was a mistake, that he had been running from his own issues, but none of his words mattered anymore. "I don't want to hear your excuses," I said, interrupting him. "I don't need your apologies. What you did to me, what you took from me, can't be undone with words." He fell silent, and for the first time, I saw the man I had loved, broken, ashamed, and realizing that I was no longer the person he had once known. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said quietly, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "But I need you to know that I'm truly sorry." I didn't know how to respond. There was a part of me that wanted to lash out, to tell him everything he had done to me and how it had scarred me. But I held my ground, my sense of self stronger than ever before. I had already forgiven him, well, Not him, but the idea of him, the person I had held on to for so long. Now, it was time to let go, fully and completely. I've moved on, Mark, I said. I don't need your apology anymore. I've found peace and I'm okay now. And I think you need to find that for yourself. We sat in silence for a few moments. Then he nodded, as if he understood. And with that, we parted ways forever. As I walked away from the cafe, I felt lighter than I had in a long time. Mark's return had not shaken me in the way I thought it would. It hadn't brought me back to the person I used to be. It had confirmed that I had already moved beyond the hurt. I was no longer defined by him or the pain of his betrayal. I was Emily, a woman who had learned to rise above it all. The story wasn't about him coming back and us fixing things. It was about me learning to heal, reclaim my life, and move on with strength and grace. It wasn't the ending I had originally imagined, but it was the one that I needed. The unexpected return didn't change my path. It only reaffirmed that my journey, on my own terms, was far more meaningful than any relationship I had ever had.